Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm looking at a subject that a number of you have asked me to explore. How can behavioural science help charities? While some of you work for not-for-profits, others volunteer or fundraise for causes they feel passionate about. And even if you're not in one of those categories, as you'll discover, there are plenty of lessons for other contexts. To help me answer that question, I thought I'd invite Maddie Croucher onto the show. She's a behavioural science practitioner who specialises in social impact work. Maddie has boosted fundraising income for Christian Aid, helped improve donor retention for DKMS, an international non-profit bone marrow donor centre, and developed interventions to tackle malnutrition with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She's also the co-author of a book called Change for Better that provides practical behavioural science help for fundraisers. In our discussion, we talk about some of the projects that Maddie's been involved in and explore some of the lessons we can learn from it. Before we begin, a reminder that if you want to be notified whenever a new episode of the show comes out, do subscribe to the podcast newsletter. There's a link to that in the show notes. With all of that said, please enjoy my discussion with Maddie Croucher on behavioural science in fundraising. Maddie, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here.
It's lovely to have you here. And look, I know who you are, but many of my listeners might not. Can you give us a little pen portrait?
Yeah, of course. So hi, everyone. My name is Maddie Croucher, and I'm a consulting director at Ogilvy's Behavioural Science practice. A little bit of context for those of you who might not be familiar with Ogilvy. We're essentially a global creative agency who offer a range of different things, advertising, PR, experience. But we also have some specialist consulting services. So I sit within the dedicated behavioural science practice. We were founded by Rory Sutherland about 10 years ago. Lots of you may have heard of him. He is a famous TED speaker, a world thought leader in behavioural science. And he founded our team, about 10 years ago. And basically what we do is come together to creatively apply insights from behavioural science to change a whole range of citizens and consumer behaviours. And I say really over the last 6 years, I've really kind of focused in on my passion area, which is applying behavioural science to drive all kinds of pro-social behaviours. So whether that's boosting supporter engagement, boosting charitable giving, or driving sustainability behaviours at scale, that's really where I like to focus my energy, although I do work on a variety of different briefs. And this is essentially what kind of led me towards co-authoring and co-editing the book Change for Better, which explores everything to do with how you can transform your supporter engagement and fundraising using behavioural science.
What I find fascinating about the sort of pro-social stuff, loosely defined, is that, of course, intuitively, this is something that we all know that we probably ought to be doing. It's a good thing to be doing. And so there are lots of examples of behavioural science interventions where you could sort of say, well, it's not obvious to people this is a good thing, or we might need to persuade them, fundamentally change their perspective on something. But actually, when you think about the sort of pro-social stuff, intrinsically and so inherently, we all know that this is a good thing to be doing. So it's quite an interesting space there in the sense that you're not having to change someone's mind about something. You're having to make them do something that in general terms, they're already going to be motivated on some level to do.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think we all inherently like to think we're, altruistic. We're kind of good people. We obviously have a certain sense of ego where we like to think we're all brilliant people, which a lot of us are. So I'll give people credit for that. I think that can sometimes lead us to believe that, of course I would donate to charity. Like I'd always support these causes because I'm a good person. I believe that. But we do know that actually often pro-social behaviours are not driven by that. They're driven by a whole host of other kind of system one things, whether that's, seeing lots of other people doing these behaviors, whether it's feeling like I'm going to have a big sense of impact. So it's an interesting one. We all like to think we're good people. And that's actually one of the reasons why, even though lots of people say they would donate, in reality, the percentages or the numbers are a lot lower because we we have that intention, but we don't lead that to an action. So it's, the age-old problem of the intention-action gap creeping in there. So it's quite an interesting one with pro-social behaviour specifically, because you're right, we don't have to necessarily motivate people, but we still do, because there's that gap to close.
And just talk us through some of the reasons that what are the sort of feeble excuses, if you like, that we use, either sort of practical or just in our minds, not to do those things.
Yeah, I think some, to your point, are feeble, for want of a better word, but some are real challenges. Like we know especially if we think of charitable giving specifically, it is such a crowded market. I mean, I couldn't even count how many different charities and causes there are to support. So you can see why it's difficult for people, because there are just so many options. I mean, I know. So
this is the jam experiment in charitable form.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly that. Yeah, there's just too many types of jam to choose between. So I think that's a major problem. There are too many causes to support. You obviously can't, or most people can't, support all of them. So it kind of leads to this choice overload, and then leads to inaction. So I think that's one of the reasons. I think another big thing is, obviously, if people are donating their money or their time or whatever, they really like to feel like that's having a tangible sort of impact on where it's going. And I think sometimes there's a bit of either like hard speculation about whether that money you're donating is being used in a good way, in an impactful way. But I think also, just from a psychological perspective, we really like to be able to see that we're having a tangible impact. We like that salient feedback. And a lot of the time when you donate money, it just goes into the abyss and you don't actually see what happens to it. And it's one of the reasons that, I don't know if you see sometimes when charities are asking for money, they'll say, £10 buys a blanket or £20 buys a first aid kit. That's why that tactic works so well. It's because you can really concretely visualize in your mind, my £10 is going to buy this tangible thing. And I can see how that's going to end up in the hands of the people, the beneficiaries it's going to. So I think that's another challenge, is sometimes you don't see that tangible impact. And again, that causes people not to donate or not to become regular givers over time.
When you talk about saliency, you would think that it would have to, you'd expect the linkage to be fully followed through. So in other words, and we've seen lots of examples of, sponsor a donkey and the thing is named and you get pictures of it and all those sorts of things, or an elephant probably. But and so there's in theory a direct link. You can sort of see where it flows out. But when the example you've just talked about, where £10 or $10 can buy X or Y, that's interesting, because it doesn't say we will use your money for that purpose. It's just creating a link in our minds that we assume, well, okay, now I can now see what that money would go towards. I don't then question, has it actually gone to that?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. And actually, a lot of the times charities can't specify. I mean, I say it's a good technique, but actually a lot of times charities can't specify that in their communications, because there's a difference between like what's called restricted fundraising and unrestricted, which basically dictates whether you can say specifically what the money will go to, because sometimes it will go to things like marketing or running costs. So yeah, it's sometimes difficult for charities to say that.
The bit I find interesting is we don't need that link, right? It's almost like a sort of system one approach where we get given an explanation, and that seems to me to be good enough. It was only in talking to you that I suddenly thought, that's interesting, because we don't sort of demand evidence there has gone to that. They've suggested a link that in our minds frames the donation around the thing that it could potentially deliver. And therefore we kind of assume that's going to happen.
Yeah, I think it works on two levels. I think it's that first level of it kind of triggers, it's that kind of motivation to donate, because you can visualize it in your mind in quite a tangible way. So that's the first thing. And I think the other is that it gives you that sense of trust. You feel like the charity's being a bit more transparent in how they operate and where the money's going. So I think, yeah, you're right. We don't need the evidence. We just need those little signals that give us that sense of reassurance. That being said, some charities do go the extra mile and show the evidence. There's a really nice example of, I think it's called Charity Water, which basically when you donate, it's all about building water pumps to give communities fresh water. And they actually have this really nice online platform where you can go in, you can see where the money's been donated and these new pumps have been built. You can go in, they show like photos of them being built. There's kind of a map that shows you how it's spreading over time. So, I mean, that's an example where you can take it a step further and visually show your supporters where the money's been going. But obviously not all charities can do that. But that's kind of next level.
That's looking at it from the side of the donors. But obviously, one of the things that we know about behavioural science is that if we want to change people's behaviour, we can't just tell them to do it. We also think about the environment and the factors that are there. What are the things that charities needs to do, and potentially what are they getting wrong in terms of approaching people?
It's a good question. I think for me, and I'd say this doesn't just apply to charities, actually, I think it applies to many different types of organizations and brands.
And that's the interesting, sorry to interrupt, that's the interesting thing here, right, is that this isn't a sort of thing where we think, well, we need a completely different approach. This is a different context. Actually, many of the things that we would see in advertising or elsewhere can, for completely different products, could have relevance here. It's the same humans we're trying to influence.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that's one of the beauties of behavioral science is the same kind of set of principles apply to anything that involves a behavior. And there are actually lots of learnings we can take, both from the kind of commercial world, if you like, that translate into charity, but also things from the charity world that could translate to commercial. So yeah, I think lots of brilliant shared learnings there. So in terms of what I think charities and general organizations, what they sometimes get wrong is I think sometimes people in marketing teams or communications teams often underestimate their own biases and how that impacts what they're creating. So something we talk about in the book quite a lot called the curse of knowledge, which is essentially where we assume that our audience has the same level of knowledge and information that we do. And therefore, when we're communicating, we're not really communicating for them, we're communicating based on our own perceptions, if that makes sense. Yeah, so I think that's one thing people get wrong, because they tend to design for themselves or their organization and not with their audience in mind. And I think that's why it's really important not to skip that first step and actually to really make sure you're truly understanding your audience, you're speaking to them and what's going to appeal and motivate to them, use their language. And above all else, just make sure it's really easy for them to understand what you're communicating, understand how to engage. And I think that's one thing a lot of organizations kind of skip because it's just so obvious.
And I think that's really interesting because that plays into the context that I do work in compliance and ethics, where if you're working in that space, and many of the listeners of this show do work in that space, you'll be thinking, well, it's blindingly obvious why this rule exists, or it's really obvious what we're trying to do with this, and so we'll just impose it because people will feel that there isn't a gap to be filled, right? They will. And I always just say, well, actually, you're spending your whole life looking at this and thinking about it, and they're not, right? And if they were interested in working in ethics or compliance, they'd be working in ethics or compliance. So instead, they're trying to do something else, and you're just trying to steer them. So stuff that's obvious to you, particularly if it's like an annual process, won't necessarily be obvious to them. And it's exactly the same thing here, where you're sort of, and I can imagine if you were working in the charitable space, you would you're so wrapped up in, and clearly you care about the thing that you're working for in most cases, I would hope. So you're wrapped up in it. You're seeing this stuff day in, day out. But of course, the people that you want to get money or time from aren't spending all their time looking at it. And it may not be obvious to them what the nature of what you're doing is, why it's significant. And so you're right. If you sell it at the sort of the expert pitch, you're going to miss a trick here because lots of people won't engage with that because they're not operating on that level.
And I think it ties back to the point we discussed earlier around people like to think that they're pro-social, altruistic, and they donate for those reasons, but they don't. So I think that that sounds really bad, but I mean, it is just true in most cases. So I think that leads us to fall into the trap of, if I tell people why this cause is so important, obviously they'll donate. If I tell them, they'll do it. All they need to know is why it's so important. And unfortunately, that's not necessarily, sometimes it is, but not necessarily the reality. So we really need to get inside our audience's mind and think about what's going to really personally resonate with them, what's going to actually motivate them. That might be a social norm, it might be something else. It's not necessarily being told how important this cause is. So I think that's the trap that we risk falling into.
And I'm always fascinated when I sort of look at some of the techniques that charities deploy. And I fall into that, what I call the Wikipedia trap. So, you know, this thing every year that Wikipedia asks for donations. And they always do that thing where they say only a tiny percentage of our people give money. And of course, newcomers to behavioral science go, they're idiots. They don't know what they're doing. You should never do that. Negative social proof. But they clearly do it each year and it works. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it. And so for some reason, there's an example of where you break what you would sort of consider to be a norm, because it seems to work in that situation. And so I'm always conscious of that when I see things like people, what's known as chugging. So these people on the street that hassle you. That seems to me to be a process that I wouldn't want to engage with. Ditto, I've heard lots of nightmare stories about charities asking people to leave things in their will, and then the charity hunts down the inheritees for the money at a time when they might not particularly fancy having their sort of phone rung or being emailed and hassled regularly. So there's lots of things that I see that I think that's really strange. That I wouldn't have expected that to work, because it's either irritating or intrusive, and yet they still do it. So I want to know your thoughts on that. Are there counterintuitive things that work? I mean, am I missing a point here, or are these things actually perhaps not as smart as they might seem?
I think it's an interesting question, and I'm glad you raised the example of Wikipedia, because you're right. That seems counterintuitive, because that just goes against everything we've learned about how social norms work. But I think it tells us a really valuable lesson in that these behavioral science tactics are a really good toolkit that we can use to kind of open up our solution space, give us inspiration. And the phrase I like to use is, we should use these examples as inspiration and not instruction. So
that's nice.
We know that context is so important when it comes to decision making and behavior. So we can't just copy and paste one strategy we see working somewhere into a new context. Like, it might not work. And I think that's why testing in this discipline is so important. Just because we know at a psychological level that these things kind of universally work, but where we place them, who our audience is, how specifically we execute them can all have a massive impact. So we need to take it as inspiration, but then test it to check it works in our context. And I think that's kind of explains the Wikipedia example. For some reason, I don't know why, it'd be interesting to research. In that context, it works really well. And like you said, they've obviously tested that. It might also it might also be to do with kind of what we call wear out effects. So I think that's a definite kind of thing to consider with the future of behavioral science. The more we use these techniques and kind of copy and paste them in the same ways over time, people are just going to start becoming attuned to them. They'll be like, oh, I've seen that kind of tactic everywhere. I kind of know what they're trying to do. And you kind of bury your head in the sand and switch off from it. So it could also be that. And I think that just shows us that it is really important to continue to find creative ways to apply these kind of fundamental principles so that they stay fresh and continue to be effective over time, even as people become more kind of attuned to them.
And what I think is interesting about the counterintuitive stuff, so the Wikipedia ones, is as you say, sort of easy to go to, easy, simple example, is that actually what's interesting about it doesn't disprove, because I've had a lot of people sort of say to me, well, that proves that social proof is nonsense. And you sort of go, no, that's a primitive analysis, because actually what it's telling you is that social bit still works, right? It's just that we're deploying it in the opposite direction. So the underlying dynamic that we've identified, that what other people do has an influence on us, we would think traditionally what you would want to do is to try and say to people, this is what lots of other people are doing. But in this case, they're just playing it the opposite way. So that doesn't rubbish the science. That just tells you that there are two angles on this particular topic.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's actually a really nice example in the book that kind of focuses on a similar thing. So we know, or maybe we don't, but there's a principle that's quite effective called the power of free. So, if things say you get something free for doing something, we're drawn to it because we love freebies and we love getting that kind of extrinsic reward. So the power of free is really, really successful in lots of different contexts. We actually tried to apply that principle in a kind of gift aiding situation. So we ran a trial with a charity where we had these donation envelopes that went through people's doors. And in one of the conditions, we tried to draw people's attention to the gift aid form. So we kind of put a big banner on it.
So for non-UK listeners, this is basically the idea that if you are a UK taxpayer, the charity can reclaim some of the tax that you have paid on that, provided so you just fill in a disclosure form. So in other words, the size of your gift is, it feels like it's a generous donation from the government. It's not, it's just recouping tax that you've previously paid on that money that you're donating.
Yeah, so we try to get people to fill in this form because obviously the charity gets more money if they do. So we put a little banner on the envelope that says, boost your donation by 25% for free. You think, okay, wow, the power of free. Obviously, people are going to want to boost their donation. This is a no-brainer. I honestly thought it was such an easy win. Makes sense from a strategic standpoint.
Yeah, because it's just right, because one, the size of your generosity is enhanced. Two, there's a nice, I'm getting money back from the tax person, right, which is always a nice feeling. So you'd think on both of those levels that would work.
Yeah, and I went in so confident it was going to work based on everything we know. And actually, in the RCT we ran, we found that that condition actually reduced return rates, so the number of people who sent the envelope back, by 50%.
5-0.
5-0, a massive amount. So actually, it just put lots of people off donating. So I thought, oh, this is interesting, surprising. And we, after a lot of discussion, we think what might be happening is that applied in this specific context around charitable giving, it actually potentially makes the act of donating too transactional. People don't like to think they're donating for themselves. By saying, you know, you get 25% for free, feels too transactional. So it maybe crowds out some of this kind of altruistic motivation for donating and turns people off. So it was quite an interesting one. And I think coming back to the point on testing, very important to test these different tactics in the specific context, because sometimes, you know, we get an interesting result. But also actually, even though it didn't work, it taught us a lot about how to frame gift aid in the future. So actually getting that kind of, you could say, bad result, I think actually was a win in the long run, because it teaches us so much about how to talk about gift aid in that context. And actually, since we ran that experiment, I've been dying to run a framing experiment around gift aid, just to do a few more tweaks and seeing if it was the word free that was the kind of main thing, or, you know, what was going on there. I think just very, very interesting.
I was giggling as you were talking about failures being incredibly, like epic fails, right, being really useful. And it reminds me of, you know, the sort of Wordles and equivalent games that people are playing nowadays. Yeah. And so on the face of it, you sort of think, right, if I guess something and I get 0 right, that's a terrible outcome, right? Because I've failed completely. But actually, it's really powerful because you've just eliminated a whole load of things. So there's a benefit in that particular, and I think that's interesting. So I'd almost argue the 50%, it's good that it's that high, because if it would be annoying if it was like, I don't know, 25% or something, because it wouldn't be as clear and as powerful a signal. So you've got a very powerful signal from that one experiment, even if it didn't go the way you thought it was going to go.
Yeah, I love that comparison. That's great.
To be honest, that's just me making myself feel better each time I do it. It's like, I'm not very good at this. Don't worry, though, because I'm winning on another level. just coming back to the point I made before around some of these things that I think are irritating. So like getting stopped in the street or getting harangued for things. That, on the face of it, that seems to me to be a bad idea, because you're particularly if they're out running errands or shopping or I don't know, and getting stopped in the street and getting hassled seems to me to be not a good idea. But that seems to be one of those ones that, maybe I'm wrong, maybe everybody else loves it, but I don't. That seems to me to be something that is, again, counterintuitive. I find it interesting that the charities almost, you're stopping someone in the street, you're getting in the way of someone doing something normally. So it's kind of obstructive, it's irritating, but yeah, they seem to do it.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I'll be honest, I don't know why it's so successful, or why charities continue to do it. You'd assume that, you know, they're basing it on some kind of data where obviously they're getting good returns. But I agree with you. Not only is there the kind of hassle factor, but as kind of times move on, it's harder and harder to generate money in that way, because lots of people don't carry cash. You know, I see them on the kind of underground in London quite a lot, and everyone's always in a rush in that context. People don't want to stop. So I'd agree with you. I'm always quite surprised about why that continues to be a channel that people use. But I'd assume from the data, it has some kind of effect. But yeah, honestly, I couldn't answer that one because I don't know myself.
The reason I mentioned it wasn't that I was expecting to have an answer, but it was more just to say that I think that's a good illustration. It's the Wikipedia thing in different form, which is where you'd sort of say, well, unless there are really irresponsible people managing these processes who are willingly throwing charitable money into a pot that is not succeeding, which I find unlikely, particularly given some of the charities involved, it clearly does have an impact. And so it comes back to, because I was the more I think about this, the more I've got I don't know what for listeners in London, Tottenham Court Road and Oxford Street are the sorts of places it seems to happen quite a bit, obviously because there's large amounts of footfall there. Therefore, it's a logical place to. But it's precisely the sort of place where I'm bustling around trying to get to and from something, and it just, I don't know, anybody that stops me in the street is just an awkward. Particularly in the UK, right? It's a particularly awkward. Don't do that. We don't talk to other people, right? Let's not say UK. Let's say London thing, right? And so I just struck me as being, it breaks a whole ton of rules, and that's what I think is fascinating about this. Is that, to your original point, actually things that you would expect to work in this context don't necessarily, and vice versa, and therefore the need to experiment becomes ever more critical. And it sort of tells me that as we look at this whole subject, and particularly as we have constraints on people's finances, as we have more, I think more and more information is going to lead to more and more competing sort of causes that people will become aware of. The need to experiment in this space is possibly, it's great everywhere, but that's a really interesting illustration that is worth trying a whole load of things here, because logic absolutely doesn't apply.
Yeah, and there's actually, thinking about the chuggers on the street example, there's a really fun, it's quite jarring, but quite a fun example of this. There was actually a social experiment run, I think it was in London, by something like the Pillon Trust, where they were looking at exactly this. They were facing a problem where they were raising money for the homeless. People on the street shouting out why this is such an important cause, asking for donations. Everyone walks by, everyone ignores them. I don't know if you've seen this campaign.
I think I know where you're about to go, okay. But if it's the one I'm thinking of, it's brilliant. Yeah.
So they did a bit of a reframing experiment where instead of saying help the poor, on some days they changed the language. I'm not going to say the word, but
feel free if you want to.
They said F the poor. So this guy on the street shouting out F the poor, and suddenly everyone stops in their tracks and is like, what? Goes up to talk to him, engages in a conversation about the problem, and kind of donates money. So this campaign sparked absolute outrage. Even me, when I was watching it, I found the video quite jarring. But that's the whole point. People are so in autopilot when they're commuting or getting where they need to go that you kind of need that reframe to snap people out of reality. And trigger that kind of reactance in people. I just thought that was such a nice example that kind of highlights your point around why that channel is so difficult.
Right. I don't know what you do with that.
Yeah.
Because I could see all sorts of reasons why it's not a good idea to try and scale that up and sort of go, I've now got your attention. But maybe that would work. I don't know. But I'll put a link to that in the show notes, because I think you're absolutely right. It's one of those ones that sort of, it seems silly, and then it just provokes this visceral reaction, both from the people that are there in the situation, but also the viewer. You kind of just watch and go, huh? And so I thought that I think even if you know what's coming, because I've watched it a couple of times, even if you know what's coming, it's still quite shocking.
Yeah, and I think to your point around how would you apply that? Obviously you wouldn't, to the point earlier, you wouldn't copy and paste that into your own campaign. Well, you could, but you might not be very good for your brand image. But I think you can take that principle of reframing, experiment with new and different ways of saying things and getting your point across that's different to everyone else in the market, so that you stand out and really cut through. I think that's kind of the learning to take from that, is that we need to kind of, trigger that reactance in people to get them to stand up and listen.
Are there any other things you discovered in your work that are sort of noteworthy, that sort of flagship things that you like to talk about?
So I mentioned the gift aid example, which is quite a standout one. There were a couple of examples in the book actually that I really liked the kind of simplicity of. So in the book, we basically have case studies from all around the world, all different continents, 24 different kind of leading practitioners around the world in a whole host of contexts. And the ones that always stood out to me were the examples that were really simple, really easy to execute, but really powerful. And there are a couple of examples in there, I guess, to the point around the F the poor example, where it triggers reactance. On the flip side of that, some examples that really trigger empathy in the audience to get them engaged. So there's a really nice example, I think it was potentially an example out of Germany, where they were it was a direct mail campaign, raising money for a blindness charity. And rather than just telling people why this was such an important cause to give to, they actually used what I like to call kind of sensory enhancement. So they actually posted this letter. They blurred out the center of the letter so you could only read what was in the periphery. And it was to really simulate the experience of beneficiaries who can't read very well due to their eyesight. And I just thought that was such a lovely way of quite viscerally kind of helping you empathize with the beneficiary. And again, that campaign was super successful because people could empathize with the beneficiaries and are more likely to go on to donate. So I think sometimes really simple creative examples like that are just really powerful.
Wow, that's because I'm visualizing that now, and actually that would work because it's, I guess, one, it's unusual, right? So you've got that piece of it, but I think secondly, that's a very powerful, as you say, that's a very powerful linkage to the cause, and of course, if we're taking, particularly if these things are in countries hundreds of miles away, and we've already seen with I'm finding it fascinating with for example, Ukraine. And here in the UK, Ukraine and Syria are both some way away, but they're both reasonably close, and yet the reaction to those two things are different. Now, there are various reasons there, but that saliency point, right? If you're getting a donation for something that's in a country to help someone who's going through an experience you've never been through, trying to put you in that position, I think is quite powerful.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the most powerful ways to get people engaged in these important causes, is to find that point of kind of empathy and shared personal experience. There was another nice example in the book, which I think was by WaterAid, and I forgot what country it was out of, but it was basically getting you to empathize with kind of girls in various different communities and why water is so important to their kind of daily hygiene. And they created this really lovely campaign called To Be a Girl, which basically encouraged girls from all over the world to share their personal experiences. And through this kind of social media campaign, really connected girls from loads of different countries who all have kind of shared similar experiences in their own context, and really created that network and kind of sense of shared identity where they could connect and kind of see how important that cause was to kind of promote people to donate. So I think that kind of creating that shared sense of identity and shared experiences is, again, something that's really powerful.
How has looking at this space changed your perspective on things? Are you, because I always find that there's an interesting thing about the more one works in sort of behavioral science space, you put on the lens. It's difficult to take the lens off. So I'm always on the lookout. I always joke about it. So I always get myself into trouble because I take pictures of weird things, like walking around the supermarket. I'm taking pictures. Oh, that's a really cool way of doing whatever. And people go, "What do you take a picture of? This is a bit suspicious." And so, but there's this strange thing that I can't let that go. And I'm assuming the same must be true of this specific space. So without wishing to pry into your personal charitable donations, has it impacted your threshold for these? So I presume you're like me, you're on the lookout for these things. So as you see them coming in, you're more alive to them. But I don't know, is your consciousness around this much more? Because one of the things I think is interesting about charitable, one of the ways that they get to us is they send stuff in the post. Now, the vast majority of people, I suspect, and this maybe is me reading too much, right, often don't bother reading those things. So there's a lot of, so I sort of see things, but I manage to ignore them. I wonder, has your perspective on that changed? Are you opening every single thing that comes to the mail because you're interested by the techniques they're using, or how does that work?
I should say yes, shouldn't I? But
well, no, I wonder because I think it's interesting. On the one hand, you're only human, and so you're going to react the way. On the other hand, you've got this lens that's there, and I was just sort of wanting to see if there was anything interesting happening in your own behaviours.
I think there's a few layers to this. I think to your first point, I mean, when I started working in this field, at first I was like seeing behavioural science nudges everywhere, and you're just like inundated by like suddenly thinking about everything that's going on. I actually, side point, I did a kind of speaking event last week, and at the end, this girl said to me, "Oh, I've never thought about my own decision making so much. I'm traumatized in a good way." I thought that was the best reaction to a behavioural science talk.
Wasn't the look I was going for, but hey, I've had an impact, right?
But yeah, so I think once you start learning about this stuff, you do start to see it everywhere. But I would say that kind of the beauty of behavioural science is that it's so system one, and it impacts us on a subconscious level. So while we might, if we're very actively paying attention to things, spot them, it still acts on a subconscious level. So it still influences even people who know about it. And I think the example I like to use, I won't name him, but my colleague, he obviously knows a lot about behavioural science, but he is, despite knowing all the tactics being applied, he is very heavily influenced by all the brilliant tactics British Airways use in their kind of loyalty programs and their tiered systems. And he knows the psychology is working on him, but it still works because it's very kind of system one and subconscious. So I think, to your point, like sometimes if I see a great example or a not so good one, I will consciously think about it because it's, a good example to have in the bank. But I'm sure there are 100 examples day to day that affect me without me really realizing it. And I kind of guess that's the point.
Right. Yeah. And I the ones I always think are fascinating is where something's happened and I'm kind of reflecting on my decision making. And usually it's around a purchase that I've made. And so I'm sort of thinking, why did I do that? And then you suddenly go, oh man, I just got legged over by, or not, right? Or it was fine because it was something that I wanted to buy anyway. But I do that kind of come back, I've done it sort of coming back from the supermarket. Why did I buy more of these things? Or what made me pick that up as opposed to that? And actually, I quite like the ones where you don't realize it when it's happening. And then it's only afterwards where you just think, oh, hold on a minute. And then I go back and sort of work out what I think has gone on, recognizing, of course, that I may not know.
I will caveat, though, I feel like we're risking making behavioural science sound very manipulative, which is not. I would say a lot of the time it is used to help you make a decision, to make your decision-making processes easier. I think fundamentally, if you don't want to do something, like you don't want to be, I'm never going to buy Marmite because I hate it. I'm maybe never going to donate to this charity because I don't believe in that cause. Nothing I do from a behavioural science perspective will change my mind. But what it will do is just help me make a decision, maybe between two different brands or between two different charities that I'm already predisposed to supporting. So I will just caveat that it's not.
No, it's good. But I mean, it's like all of these things, right? It's sort of, it can be used for good or it can be used for bad. Mm-hmm. And it's not as if these things, I always find the fascinating discussions around, well, let's add some behavioural science here, as if there isn't any implicit in already. You can't, to quote, I think it's Sunstein, the old, you can't have a neutral choice architecture, right? So on some level, we're always being persuaded by various factors because we're trying to make sense of the world. So to a certain extent, I love joking about the manipulative end of it because it's kind of fun and looking at things like dark patterns and those sorts of things. But actually, it can also be used as a force for good. And it's just a case of saying, actually, and we're only influenceable up to a point, as you say. Ultimately, if I really don't want to do something, it's going to be quite a big ask to get me to do it.
Yeah, and I think another point, just to add on to that, is that, marketers, advertisers have been intuitively using these techniques for, years and years before even behavioural science was really a formalized discipline. And still to this day, people do just kind of intuitively use these techniques. I think what behavioural science does is really starts to kind of codify it so that we can test and learn and kind of attribute names and labels to things so that we can just use it more effectively. But you're right, a lot of this stuff is kind of naturally intuitive and can be used in a whole different variety of ways.
And you talked a little bit about what you want to sort of redo is the wrong word, but sort of take the gift aid piece a bit further. Are there any other areas that sort of have piqued your curiosity in this space that you want to look at?
Oh, good question. We ran another example from the book. It's actually part of the same experiment. We got a lot of interesting findings in this direct mail experiment that Ogilvy ran with Christian Aid. And Another condition we tested uses a principle called costly signaling. So it basically says that we're more motivated by something if we believe the organization has kind of parted with some additional cost. And it's because it essentially signals to us that the organization believes enough in their own cause to, give something a bit extra. So it makes us trust them more. So we see this used in lots of contexts. So this one's quite counterintuitive for the charity sector, who are obviously always looking to reduce their overheads. We know supporters are very overhead averse. They want to know their money is going directly to the beneficiaries, not on all this other stuff. But this was a counterintuitive thing that we tested, where we basically didn't change any of the messaging on the envelope. We just increased the thickness of the paper. So the thickness of the paper was slightly heavier. The envelope felt a little bit more premium. And we actually found that it was really significantly effective. I think it boosted average gift by about 18%. It increased donations over £200 quite significantly as well, which is quite a lot for a kind of direct mail campaign. So it's a really interesting one because it just shouldn't work in a charity space, because spending more is generally not a good thing. But in this case, it was so subtle that it worked on that system one level. People didn't even consciously realize the envelope was thicker, but it made them trust where their money was going on a kind of psychological level. And I think there's something really interesting in that to explore more. I would hate to say that I think as a blanket term, costly signaling works in this space. I think it was very specific execution. So I think it would be interesting, especially because we talk about this example so much, I think it'd be interesting to test some different executions of costly signaling, just to really start to understand like exactly how is that principle working in this space. Just because it is such a counterintuitive one.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because you sort of, there's just the basic logic of they are wasting money on expensive paper ought to put you off. But I suppose, it's your point. I mean, you're almost saying, right, how far can we push this? And what are the buttons that we're pressing in doing so?
Yeah. And I think just making sure we're really understanding the strategies we're applying. I think for me, that's what interested me. Like, it's great when something works, but I really want to understand, like, why is it working? Or with the gift aid example, why is that not working? And just get a bit deeper. Because that's what enables us to take those learnings forward. Yeah.
Right, but I mean that must have been and I'm not asking you to reveal any sort of intricacies, but I imagine, as you say, this you're asking somebody to adopt a strategy that just feels weird, right? It's not in the normal playbook. And of course, that's the benefit of having people coming in to challenge that, because it's something you would probably not have thought of doing or dared to doing. And you've got if you've got some external thinking to support you with some expertise in the space, you feel a bit more confident trying it. But it's a fascinating thing that you can get somebody to really try something there, because I would have thought that if you were proposing that would be an immediate no. A little bit like the F the Poor campaign. You could sort of say, well, this is something that could work. And they go, no, there's no way we can do that. And I find it really interesting that you persuade them to say, well, let's spend a bit more money on this thing and see what happens. I mean, that's the sort of, that's kind of like a dream client in a way, that's prepared to push things a bit more, because that's when you get it's really pushing those boundaries that you start to see some interesting things.
Yeah, we were very lucky in this case. And I think it's lovely when you get that opportunity where you have a client who's really excited by behavioural science and really wants to kind of test these different strategies. So we were definitely lucky in this case. I think it is fair to say, though, that the kind of cost of the extra envelope was kind of negligible. I think it was like less than 1p extra, basically. We did previously try another campaign where we were going to put like a chocolate coin in the envelope as a bit of reciprocity, and also to kind of prompt that idea of putting money in the envelope. But actually that was interestingly a step too far, because that was seen as explicitly giving a gift. And a lot of kind of the volunteers distributing the envelopes weren't necessarily happy with it, because that kind of went a bit too into system two, and did feel like too much of a hard cost. Whereas the thicker envelope was so subtle, it didn't trigger that reaction. So there's like a fine line, which is quite interesting.
Oh, that's an interesting thing about feeling that sense of comfort and sort of fair. Is this fair? Is this appropriate? I thought about it from the perspective of the donors, but you're absolutely right. It's the people within the charity who sort of, is this what we're about? And is this okay to do? Becomes quite a significant factor.
Yeah, because I'm sure none of the people receiving the envelope with the chocolate coin would be complaining. I'm sure everyone would love that. Right. Although, no, that's not true, actually. Some people might think, the charity's wasting money. But yeah, there's definitely kind of multiple audiences to consider, which is interesting.
Amazing. And so, what's as we've talked a little bit about sort of some of the charitable things. What's next without again revealing client confidentiality? What's next on the agenda for you? What's keeping you occupied?
Ooh, lots of fun stuff. So I do work a lot in the kind of pro-social space. So got lots of interesting things, especially in emerging markets at the moment. Which is interesting. I'm talking very vaguely because I'm not sure what I can share, but also work on a whole host of other challenges. So actually do a lot of organizational change work, which is really interesting. So looking at how we can kind of facilitate collaboration within teams, get teams to be kind of more accountable in their day-to-day, which is really interesting. We're doing a lot of interesting work at the moment on how we can use behavioral science to build more effective loyalty programs for various brands, which is super interesting. And yeah, we actually just this month, actually yesterday, although I don't know when this is going out, released our 2022 Behavioural Science Annual, which publishes all our case studies from the last year. It's actually a global edition of our case studies from all around the world, and some really lovely creative examples in there. Whole host of different behaviours. But yeah, I think that just really shows the breadth of the type of work we're doing at the moment and how exciting it is.
And I always find that amazing, right? Because I read it, there's always something in there that blows my mind. So I hadn't thought about that application, or that's really interesting. And so I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well, because I think that's definitely worth picking up as a sort of, if you were wondering about the limits of behavioral science, you suddenly start to go, oh, there's a lot more we can do with this. Recognizing, of course, we have to say this is not the panacea to everything.
Yeah, and I think this year especially, there's some really nice examples of behavioral design. So it goes beyond communications, and actually how can we weave some of these behavioral science tactics into how we design products so that people don't even have to read something and engage with it. It just becomes like a default behavior. There's some really lovely examples of that type of thing in this year.
I love that. Because I always think it's fascinating. It's sort of like, if you need to put instructions with this thing, then there's a design flaw in there are ways to design things. Now, clearly you want to make sure if it's sort of dangerous equipment that there are some instructions there if necessary, but let's try and design out the need for people to spend hours looking at instruction manuals before they can do something. So I'm a huge fan of that thinking, because that of course takes you into behavioral design as opposed to just the sort of behavioral science analysis. So that is keep going on that mission, because I would love it if we could get rid of most instruction manuals.
Yeah, definitely. There's just, so much power and impact we have from behavioral design. I think that's definitely a space where we're trying to move a lot more into.
And then the other thing you're obviously getting ready for, and I'm going to be talking to some of your colleagues, so Dan Bennett and a few other colleagues are coming on the show a little bit later in the year, ahead of this happening, but you're obviously getting ready for Nudge Stock as well. So do you want to just do a quick plug for that ahead of time?
Yeah, so Nudge Stock, I'm going to get the date wrong now, so you have to correct me in the edit if I'm wrong, but I think it's on the 10th of June this year. I mean, it's an interesting one because the pandemic obviously forced us to completely change the way we do Nudge Stock, and it's actually opened up a lot of interesting opportunities. I'm not going to spoil what's coming this year, but there are some very exciting new things coming. I'll let Dan tell you when you speak to him. But yeah, 10th
amazing.
of June.
No, and look, I'll be talking a lot more about that nearer the time, because it's one of those days that I used to thoroughly enjoy my day out at the seaside. But I'm willing to accept that actually an online thing allows for a lot more possibilities. So I think it's very exciting, and I loved what you've done with it. So on behalf of all of us that enjoy it, thank you for all the work that goes on behind the scenes, because it is absolutely fabulous. So we'll plug more of that as we go. And as I say, look out for some of Maddie's colleagues coming to an episode soon. Maddie, thank you so much for all of the time. Final thing is, tell people the name of the book and where they can find it.
Yeah, so the book is called Change for Better, and you can buy it in most markets on Amazon. That's the best place to buy it. And maybe I'll let you know a few other links in the show notes as well. But Change for Better, I would say primarily focused on fundraising, but lots of examples that span more broadly into designing comms and communications, big kind of behavior change or comms campaigns. And there's a nice kind of toolkit of different tactics you can take away and apply to whatever work you're doing.
I think that's a really interesting point, right? Which is back to this isn't a sort of just copy and paste thing, but I often find looking in completely different contexts produces some really interesting inspirations. And so the key piece here is not to say, I will that worked in this case, I'll slavishly copy it, but actually just read it and let your mind wander a bit. And I think it's always fascinating to read about interventions, particularly those that really work well or really didn't work. You can sort of just let the brain go to some interesting places, and that I find it from a creativity perspective fascinating. So I'm a huge fan, and I really enjoyed reading the book around thinking in these terms, because I don't work in a charity, but a lot of the thinking behind it can inform some other things.
Yeah, definitely. I think take inspiration, not instruction, and anyone can take inspiration from anywhere.
Love it. Maddie, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Maddie for appearing, and to you for listening. To find out more about the work that Maddie talked about, her co-authored book, Change for Better, profits from that, by the way, go to charity Médecins Sans Frontières, so well worth supporting for that alone. And to discover how to get your free ticket to Nudgestock, Ogilvy's Festival of Behavioural Science, on the 10th of June, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To be notified whenever a new episode of the show comes out, do subscribe to the podcast newsletter. There's a link to do that in the show notes as well. To find out more about human risk and the work that I do with my clients in helping them mitigate theirs, visit human-risk.com. I'll be back with another episode of this show very soon, but in the meantime, stay safe, good luck with your fundraising, and thanks for listening.